Now we get to the fun part. I'm so looking forward to talking to my revered old friend, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you.
Pico has also left us with some questions, and I think that's one of the things that I'm going to try and get out of him. The silence in the Benedictine monastery. Is this in any way reminiscent of the ancient practice of vipassana that we hear about in India, where again it's meditation in silence, or is there something different about the Benedictine practice?
Very, very similar, I would say. And I think all the great traditions have different names and different definitions for coming to exactly the same place. It's as if there are many different paths to the top of the mountain. I think the main difference is that the place where I go to has no formal practice, no leaders, no rules, essentially. It's absolutely free. And so the monks leave every visitor on her own, so she can take a walk or read or do what's hardest of all, nothing at all. And they're confident that whoever you are, whatever your background or lack of background, you'll find what you need. So it's not a guided collective practice as Vipassana is. But living near Kyoto as I do, as you can imagine, for years I would see people returning from their Vipassana practice, 10-day retreats, and they were electric. They were walking on the clouds. And I could just see how elevated and clarified they had been by that. I just recently actually did a public event with a young person called Young Pueblo, Ecuadorian American, whose life was so transformed by Vipassana practice that he now goes on 45-day retreats. He's a professional meditator, and he has 3 million followers on Instagram, which shows that there's a universal longing. But I think the heart of this, which links Vipassana and meditation and the Benedictine monks that I go to, is the silence. And I know, Thomas Merton, the monk who lived so close to silence for 27 years, said there's more substance in silence than in the answer to any question. So actually, I trust my silences more than I trust my answers. And there was a wonderful Benedictine monk called Father Thomas Keating, who used to say something I think anyone in India would recognize: silence is God's language, and everything else is a pure translation, or poor translation.
There's a very similar thought in the Upanishads, but that silence is also meant in some ways to represent that which cannot be expressed, that just so ineffable it is beyond human comprehension and cannot be reduced to words. But no, I'm not going to let you off the hook. Have you ever tried Vipassana? Is that something that you were tempted by at any point? Have you experienced the difference between the one and the other?
I haven't experienced it. And I think I was tempted, but since I found this course, I've stayed with it. The Tibetans say much better to dig one ditch or one well that's 60 foot deep rather than 10 that are 6 foot deep each. So once I found this, I thought, let me go deeper into this rather than trying something else.
So what do you do when you're still? I mean, you mentioned there's no leader, no guide, no one telling you what to do. So how do you derive an organized benefit? If you're sitting there still and silent, now you probably have a far more disciplined mind than I do. I'm just curious, doesn't your mind want to wander off and take you to other places?
It does. I mean, as a fellow writer who's more prolific than I am, much of your life is spent in silence at the desk, yes? Following the trains of the mind and also seeing what's on the far side of the mind. I loved what you said about how the silence speaks for the inexpressible, which I think most of us trust more than anything human. That's, I think, the heart of our discomfort with AI. It's coming from a group of engineers, and the typhoons are coming from what the monks call acts of God. So they're going to defeat AI probably. So what I do there is allow myself a holiday and understand a holy day the way I never do. This may be true with you because you're so full of energy. When I go on holiday, I map out an itinerary. 8 o'clock I'm here, 10 o'clock I'm there. So I never allow myself just to wander or get lost or do nothing. And this is the one place where I allow myself not to write. And when I wake up, I just follow intuition and the moment. I think, I'll take a walk and see the sun rise up over the hill. Or I'll pick a book at random out of my suitcase. Or I'll just sit there. Just sit. And I never allow myself to do that, usually.
I see. So you can pick a book up, but you wouldn't be allowed to write because the music of the words you're writing would probably interfere with your silence, wouldn't it?
Yes. Well, this is why it's such a liberal place. You are allowed to read and you are allowed to talk. Not in the retreat house, but when you walk along the road, you're allowed to seek spiritual counsel from the monks or just talk to a friend. So now I go there with my wife, and she and I stay in separate places, but we share meals together, talking quietly, and we share long walks at sunrise and sunset. And the big surprise for me, I think more than you, I love being by myself. I'm an only child. I spend my whole life at my desk. I'm not engaged in the real world the way you are. So when I got there, I thought, this is heaven. I can spend my whole day by myself. And as I started going there more often, I found actually the solitude is a gateway to community and compassion, because of course the monks are the opposite of solitary and silent. They're working around the clock to take care of one another and to take care of their visitors. They're cooking and raising vegetables and fixing the generator and taking care of accounts, and a very busy life, 24 hours a day for the rest of their lives. And when I stay with them, it's not heavenly at all. It's like being in an office in some ways. But when I walk along that road, if I meet a stranger and we exchange a couple of sentences, we can sense the silence from which their sentences come. In other words, the sentence I hear lives within me for a long time, as it wouldn't on the streets of Mumbai. And I can sense that the two sentences the stranger has exchanged are coming from the depths of her. And so the curious thing is that whoever I meet on that road, I trust and I feel an instant kinship to. And sadly, that doesn't happen on the streets of New York City or even on the streets of Japan, because we're joined not by our jobs or where we happen to live or where we happen to go to college, but by the fact we've both been drawn to this silence and to whatever is inexpressible, as you said. So we're linked really by what's deepest in us and not just surface features or characteristics.
I am curious. I first discovered Pico as I would argue a travel writer. His first couple of books were about discovering other worlds. And then, if I look at his last half a dozen titles, I don't know if some of them are simply different editions of the same book, but you've got The Half-Known Life, you've got A Flame, Learning from Silence, you've got The Art of Stillness, Falling Off the Map, Abandon, The Man Within My Head. One can't get away from the thought that you are, in a sense, escaping from the world. Is that unfair?
I hope it's incomplete. It's not unfair. But I remember when I was a little boy, you might have had the same thought. I thought there were two things I need to do. One is to get to know the world. And both of us were born in the first generation when we could be in Tibet or Ethiopia or Bolivia tomorrow. And I wanted to make the most of that. And the second was, I need to get to know the self. As Mr. Sarkar was saying in his introduction, I need to know the person who's seeing the world and his delusions and projections and prejudices. So my last book, The Half-Known Life, was about North Korea and Iran and Kashmir and Sri Lanka, and mostly places of conflict and places of difficulty, the kind of places you're dealing with in the UN, because I need to know what's happening in the real world. And the sister book to it was about the monks who are living a life of absolute stillness. And so I'm always trying to do justice to both, keep myself moving around the world and root that movement in stillness, because I think the travel is only as rich as the stillness that underwrites it. But without both of them, I feel I would be not a complete human being.
So each complements the other.
Precisely.
You can't be accused of abandoning the world, of
I hope not.
escaping reality. No, I mean, it's fascinating because you have, of course, written a lot about the world. Video Night in Kathmandu, Tropical Classical, The Global Soul, Sun After Dark, Flights into the Foreign, The Asiatics, Cuba and the Night. So all of these have been different ways of discovering different parts of the world, and Pico writes so uncommonly well. As you've heard, he speaks uncommonly well as well, so it's always a joy to read him. I haven't yet read him on stillness, I have to confess, and I'm very curious about that, but I thought you would whet my appetite for it, and you have. Thank you. But if I can turn you from that into something you briefly mentioned on side. You said that the 1990 fire taught you, in some ways, much about having a life with very little. I mean, you restarted life with a toothbrush and a bare floor to sleep on. Did you find yourself becoming more minimalist in your demands out of life as a result of that? Have you consciously eschewed material possessions, for example? Have you felt that you can get by with less, and is that therefore something you'd recommend to others? Or on the contrary, was it a moment of privation that you were only happy to overcome? And have you accumulated all the detritus of 21st century life, your mobile phones and laptops and iPads and cars and God knows what else, that are in some ways the accompaniments to the the simple process of being alive today?
Yes, and just before I answer that, thank you for reading me so thoughtfully and listening to me so sensitively. And I think you are probably guilty also of living in the world of stillness and movement, because your novels are works of imagination that clearly come from sitting still, and then so much of your nonfiction and your life as a politician is right in the real world. But yes, so after my book Aflame came out last month, I found myself giving readings in the heart of devastated Los Angeles to people who just lost everything in the world, as I did many years ago. And I heard myself saying that that particular evening, most of what I saw was the loss. And as the months and years went on, I saw indeed, as your question suggests, that it could be a liberation and I could gain something. So when the insurance company came along and offered to replace my goods, I realized I didn't need 90% of the books and furniture and clothes I'd accumulated. Just as you say, I could live much more minimally as I'd always wanted to. And because I lost all those notes for my next 3 nonfiction books, I thought, I've got to write from memory and imagination and heart, which are actually much deeper places than the notes, as you know. And so I tried writing fiction, which I'm sure I would have been too scared to attempt otherwise. And lacking a physical home in California, I started moving towards Japan, which of course is the spiritual home of minimalism and freedom from clutter and the empty tatami room. And I think there's a wisdom in the Japanese aesthetic whereby you go into a room, there's nothing there but a scroll and a vase. And because there are only 2 things there, you bring all your attention to them and you see the whole universe in that vase and the scroll, is the idea, at least. So I think losing so much in the fire did help me realize what I cherished. I thought a lot about it during the pandemic, when all of us were taking this enforced retreat. And I think many of us suddenly began to notice what do we really care about? Our friends, our family, what is the most essential thing? It actually sifted the trivial from the essential very much. And the other curious thing is that I mentioned buying the toothbrush and going to sleep on my friend's floor, but because in those long ago days, my job was to be a columnist for Time magazine. Before I went to sleep, the night of the fire, I went to write a piece for Time magazine. I used to write the back page essay. And I described the day that had just transpired, because I'd had this eyewitness view on a major news event. And because I'd been spending time in Japan already, I ended it with a poem that I'd found from the 17th century. Not well known then, but now I think quite familiar to some, from a guy called Masahide. It's a haiku, and he wrote, "My house burnt down, I can now see better the rising moon." So the very night when I lost everything in the world, at 33 years old, something in me that was wiser than I realized it wasn't only a bad thing, and that actually it would sharpen my sense of priorities. And I'd always told myself, home isn't where you live, it's what lives inside you. And of course, the night of the fire, I realized yes, because I still had my mother, I still had my wife-to-be, I still had the songs that go through my head, I still had my favorite books. I'd lost everything material, but I still had a lot of things that were essential, if that's an answer.
Fascinating, yes, absolutely. Yes, I think you can see the reaction of people here. The theme of this overall ABP network's ideas of India is humanity's next frontier. And obviously AI is a very large part of that frontier. In many ways, what you've been reflecting on is sort of parallel to the questions that AI has been raising about what exactly it means to be human. If AI can now write a love poem to your girlfriend, as teenagers are discovering it can do, what is it that makes you human and different from AI? Obviously AI can't feel what it's writing. It's merely learned these words and knows they're appropriate to write on Valentine's Day or whatever. What does it mean to be human? And how do we find out what our humanity is in this age of AI, which is only on the ground floor? My God, the possibilities of what AI can and will be doing for us and to us is infinite, right? So we can only begin to grasp how it's going to change our lives. What about us? Who are we? I mean,
of course, I'm in no position to tell us who we are, but I think the answer to your question is everything intangible and essential. What Mr. Sarkar said in his introductory remarks, it's the thing that AI can't give us is a sense of how to make wise and discerning use of AI. And for that, we have to go within. AI couldn't, I think, conduct this conversation between the two of us, couldn't speak for you or for me entirely. I think the question I ask myself, and the reason that I keep going to that hermitage, is what do you have to bring to the ICU, to the intensive care unit? Because at some time in life, probably both of us and many of the people we care for are going to end up there. And when I go, and not long ago, I suddenly got a phone call that my mother had had a stroke and she was teetering between life and death for 35 days, and I was in the ICU with her. And I thought, actually, my bank account is of limited use here. All the books I've written are beside the point. My resume is useless. The only thing I can bring to her and bring to myself in this difficult moment is whatever resources I've gathered within, which for me have probably come sitting in one place in silence. And I'm not sure that AI would have those resources or would be able to bring to my mother, as she's teetering in that state, the things that she most needs. It's interesting, I was at Dartmouth College a few weeks ago, and I was having lunch with a group of very intelligent graduate students. And one of them was a young Brazilian who loves reading. He's probably read all your books and some of mine. He feasts on literature and serious nonfiction. But his field was AI. So at the end of it, I asked him exactly the question you just asked me. And he just read one of my books and he'd enjoyed it. And I said, could AI write that book? He said, oh yeah, it'll write it much better than you did within 7 or 8 years. There were 3 women around the table, one of them from Mumbai, and they said, well, what about compassion? What about soul? What about humanity?
That's right.
Yeah. And obviously my prejudice was with the ladies, though I have to listen to what this expert in AI had told me. So there are many in this room who would know more than I about AI and its capabilities. But I think everything that distinguishes us as humans is by definition what AI can't replicate. I don't know, what do you think?
You know, I think that's a very good way of putting it, that everything that distinguishes us as human is what AI can't represent. But is it, number one, entirely accurate? Because already AI can represent, in the sense that a mirror can reflect who you are. It can't reflect what you're thinking, what you're feeling, but certainly you stand in front of it and it shows you everything about that you're pico-aya, that you look like this, what you're wearing, how your nose is shaped. You know what I'm saying? And so, for all practical purposes, if that's the appropriate phrase, it can depict and reflect and represent to that degree pico-aya. Now, what can it not do? Now, we believe it can't think like you, but perhaps your Brazilian friend will disagree, because if you run every single word you've ever written, every book, every column, through a sophisticated enough AI program, maybe it can turn out a pico-aya book that looks as if you've thought of it. I don't know. I mean, it's entirely possible from what little I'm hearing. And in that case, what makes you different? Maybe AI is inventing emotions it hasn't, quote-unquote, felt, whereas you're writing about feelings that you've actually experienced. But can a reader tell the difference? It's an alarming thought, Pico. I don't know what your answer would be.
Yes, I mean, I haven't thought about it much myself before, but my sense is unexpectedness is something it can't do so well. Surprise. So people have sent me, they've asked AI, write such and such in the style of pico-aya, and I'm sure you've had the same.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It does a very good result. But 2 years ago, I brought out a book about traveling around the world. And so AI would take that and start writing about Iran and North Korea, which has nothing to do with my book about sitting still with the monks for 34 years. So as long as we keep surprising ourselves, we're always going to be ahead of AI, my sense is, because it's working with the pico-aya that already exists online. And the hope is that pico-aya, who's alive this moment,
is going beyond what pico-aya did.
Precisely. If nothing else, I'm doing something different this morning than I'd ever done yesterday. So
That's our hope, is in our originality, in our authenticity.
Maybe.
Now, you still continue to divide your life between Japan and America, or is it Japan and the rest of the world?
More happily Japan and the rest of the world. And left to my own devices, I probably spent every day of my life in Japan. And I was thinking about how Japan is an interesting complement to India, as you know, I'm sure, because on the very different on the surface in the terms it's so orderly, it's so shy, it's so regimented. But deep down, in terms of sort of traditional values, respect for elders, sense of community, it's the Buddhist philosophy it took essentially from India. I think it has a lot in common, more in common with India than Europe might. So, to put it another way, when I married a Japanese woman, my Indian mother was relieved because she thought it's not so different from having an Indian daughter-in-law. Whereas if she had had a Swedish or American, she might have thought, well, this daughter-in-law is not going to know what to do with me. And the other interesting thing about Japan, as probably everyone here knows, is going through this huge tourist boom at the moment. You can barely walk along the narrow streets of Kyoto at times. So many people, many of them from India, are there. 90 million people visited Kyoto last year. Many of them domestic, but also the number of foreign tourists has gone up 15-fold in the last 22 years. And the reason for that, as most of you know, because I'm sure people here have been to Japan, is that it's not like anywhere else. It's like another planet.
It is. And certainly as an Indian, I felt that very keenly. In every respect. I mean, you know, taxi drivers wearing white gloves, people standing in the subways to prise open the doors and push you in. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And of course, the cleanliness of the place is mind-boggling to the Indian sensibility. But I'm curious about this new cultural revival in the West about Japan. I mean, I remember reading the book Shogun 50 years ago when it came out. Apparently, it's now an absolutely hugely successful television series on OTT. Then Wim Wenders has made a movie about a Japanese toilet cleaner, and it's a huge success.
Yes.
Have you watched these? Have you seen them? Do they represent some sort of Japan that exists in the real life that you know so well?
Wonderfully. Unfortunately, I got sent a link to the Wim Wenders movie Perfect Days right after the main actor Koji Yakusho won the Best Actor Award at Cannes. So my wife and I watched it twice in 5 days, and we were reduced to tears both times. Because it seemed the deepest, most meditative, subtlest movie we'd seen in a long, long time. And actually it speaks to exactly what we were talking about earlier, because it's so quiet and nothing happens, and it's about a person who's made a kind of perfect, quiet, simple, restrained life. And then I got to spend 3 days with the star and Wim Wenders at the Telluride Film Festival, interviewing them on stage and off stage. And I was so delighted first that a German man could make a film that, had I not known better, I would be sure was made by a Japanese.
Wow.
And the main actor, Mr. Yakusho, was so shy and self-effacing and quiet on stage that he incarnated, I think, some of the beautiful qualities in Japan. And I was going to say that the fact that Japan is a different planet has really hurt it geopolitically, because it's not on the same wavelength as the rest of the world, even the way China and South Korea are. But culturally, it's its great blessing, and that's why everyone wants to go to Japan, because it's not like anywhere else. And I think in some ways, to answer the end of your question, one thing that Japan and India share, to my mind, is that they take in everything from the rest of the world and all the latest developments and remain deeply themselves in the midst of that. And so my image of Japan is an old man in a Planet Hollywood t-shirt. In other words, he's up to the minute, he's cool, he's got all the global stuff, but he's still old and he's still Japanese. And when I go to, let's say, Varanasi, I see McDonald's outlets and Starbucks and shopping malls, but I feel at heart it's still the old Varanasi. And that neither of these cities, I hope, is going to become something entirely different. The roots are very deep in India and Japan, I feel.
Well, that is the world in many ways, isn't it? I mean, I remember, since we've just been through the Kumbh Mela, still going through it, I remember an image from a previous Kumbh Mela of this naked sadhu, right out of Hollywood Central Casting, you know, Rudrakshamala around his neck, completely bare torso, matted hair, scraggly beard, you know, what's on his face, just completely staring away into the distance, this classic picture of timeless otherworldliness. And while he was staring away, he was chatting
TV?
into a mobile phone. I wanted to use that as the cover image for my book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, but my publishers tell me, oh, it's too much of a cliche, they wouldn't agree. But it is also part of the same thing, this living in two centuries at once, just as you live in the world of travel and the world of stillness at the same time, Pico. I'm afraid we're out of time. Do we have an extension, folks, or do I have to wrap up? I have to wrap up. Well, let me thank Pico Iyer for this delightful excursion, incursion, whatever, into himself, into our lives, into the world of the 21st century. His book in India, the book is called A Flame Abroad, and here it's called In Search of Stillness, right?
Learning from Silence, yes. Learning from Silence.
Learning from Silence is the Indian edition. I recommend it strongly, simply because though I haven't yet read it, and I will, I like everything Pico writes. Pico Iyer, ladies and gentlemen, give him a hand.
And thank you. It's such an honor to share a stage with you.
Thank you both gentlemen. I'm sure the audience agrees with me when I say we could have listened to you and not want silence on the stage for another couple of hours. Thank you so much for that engaging conversation. Please do remain on stage as I invite Dhruva Mukherjee, Director, ABP Network, and Mayank Agarwal, MD, Gallant Group of Industries, to present Mr. Iyer with a token of our gratitude. What a wonderful conversation with many takeaways for all of us, how we can choose just a bit of silence in our everyday busy lives to find the purpose, to find the stillness within. Thank you very much to our presenters. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, and thank you very much